yellow that makes chocolate-flavored milk.
Screaming yellow.
KFC toasted brat for just $1.29.
Do you remember those budget snacks? The ones you bought not because you loved them, but because they were all you could afford? In the 1970s, these no-frills treats filled lunchboxes, quieted cravings, and stretched a few cents farther than anyone thought possible. But looking back now, why do the cheapest snacks carry the richest memories? Off-brand cereal in the giant bag was the closest thing to name-brand magic you could get on a shoestring budget. It sat low on the shelf, beneath all the brightly colored boxes, in a clear plastic bag with no mascot, no cartoon, no promise, just volume. And that was the point. You got 3 times as much for half the price. It was never quite right. Fruity Rings instead of Fruit Loops, corn squares instead of Chex, but if you squinted, it still looked like breakfast. You poured it into the same old bowl, added milk, and pretended. The crunch never lasted more than 5 minutes, but it was enough to keep you going until lunch. And even when the taste was off, it still came with the comfort of something sweet and fast. Sometimes it was too sugary. Sometimes it was bland. But you kept eating it day after day because it was there. No prize inside. No maze on the back. Just food that filled your stomach and freed up a little more room in the grocery budget. Moms bought it because it stretched. Kids ate it because they had to. And if the bag got torn, you clipped it shut with a clothespin and called it good. Because in the 70s, good enough was plenty. Kool-Aid packets were 10 cents of pure power. You stood in front of that shelf full of little envelopes and picked your color. Not your flavor, your color. Red, purple, blue. You poured it into a stained plastic pitcher, added way too much sugar, and stirred until your arm hurt. It was never cold enough. It was never sweet enough. So you added more sugar, and then a little more. It was childhood alchemy. Just water, sugar, and a tiny dust cloud of artificial fruit. And somehow, it tasted like summer and freedom and bare feet on hot pavement. Kids drank it by the gallon. Parents rolled their eyes but kept buying it because it was cheap and it worked. You brought it to school in old peanut butter jars. You poured it into red cups at birthday parties. You drank it out of the pitcher when no one was looking. It stained your mouth, your shirt, your mom's counters. But it was glorious. The flavor did not matter. The brand did not matter. It was bright, fast, and yours. And for a dime, you felt rich. Government cheese cubes were solid gold in the food world, even if they came in a box with no label and weighed as much as a car battery. If you were lucky enough to get it, you guarded it like treasure. It was thick, rubbery, and kind of impossible to slice cleanly. But it melted like nothing else. You stacked it on crackers, stirred it into pasta, snuck little cubes straight from the fridge when no one was watching. It was sharper than American cheese, but smoother than cheddar, its own mysterious category of flavor. And every bite tasted like survival, plus a little bit of gratitude. Grilled cheese made with government cheese could silence a whole table. Mac and cheese made with it was a special occasion. It never spoiled. It just waited. The cardboard box it came in was plain, but opening it felt like unboxing a miracle. Your mom would cut it into blocks and freeze it just to make it last. You did not waste it. You never wasted it. It was food that showed up when times were hardest, and somehow made everything feel just a little more okay. Generic peanut butter was sticky, oily, and always needed a good stir. But it got the job done. It came in a plastic tub with a white label that just said peanut butter in plain black print. No mascots, no frills. You had to dig through the thick top layer of oil to get to the spreadable stuff. And once you stirred it, game on. You slapped it onto white bread, stirred it into oatmeal, or ate it straight from the spoon. It stuck to the roof of your mouth and made your whole face work to chew. And still, it felt like protein and pride packed into a sandwich. It was cheaper than the name brands, and you could stretch one jar across 2 weeks of school lunches. When the jelly ran out, you ate it plain. When the bread ran out, you used crackers or pancakes, or nothing at all. Kids brought it to school in brown paper bags. Moms bought the biggest tub they could afford. It was not fancy, but it was always there. Macaroni and cheese in a box was not just dinner, it was therapy in powdered form. The blue box kind was a treat, but store-brand versions were more common. No cartoon characters, just a label and a promise. This will feed you. You boiled the elbow macaroni, drained it, dumped in the orange powder, and stirred in margarine and milk, if you had some. If not, just margarine, or just water, or just whatever you had. The cheese powder never dissolved all the way, and you always ended up with orange streaks on the side of the pot. But no one cared, because the first bite still tasted like something warm and good. It was a side, it was a main. It was a late-night snack and a school lunch all in one. You could throw in peas, cut up hot dogs, eat it cold if needed. Everyone had a way they made it better, even if there was not much to work with. The box cost next to nothing. The comfort was priceless. Hot dogs in bulk packs were a fridge staple, the kind of thing that felt like a full meal even when it technically was not. You could buy a pack of 12 for less than $1 and stretch it across a week with enough bread and ketchup. Some families boiled them, some fried them, some ate them cold, right from the pack. They were made of who knows what, but they were salty, warm, and filled your belly fast. They were lunch, dinner, snacks, and sometimes even breakfast, just sliced and fried with eggs if you had any. You could make 3 meals out of 2 hot dogs if you knew how to stretch it right. They made you feel like you were eating meat, even when the label made you suspicious. You could put them in a bun, slice them into beans, or roll them up in a piece of white bread if that was all you had. Hot dogs were the utility players of working-class kitchens. They made dinner possible when the fridge was looking empty. They were always there, quiet, dependable, and ready to be anything you needed them to be. Ramen noodles were not trendy or ironic in the 70s. They were survival food. The square block of dried noodles and the little foil packet of salt disguised as broth made for the fastest hot meal you could get on pennies. You dropped them in boiling water, stirred, and had soup in minutes. Sometimes you added an egg or chopped hot dogs if you were lucky. Most of the time, you just added hot water and told yourself it was enough. You ate them at the counter, by the stove, or on the couch, anywhere you could slurp in peace. The flavor packet turned tap water into something that felt like it had substance, even if it really didn't. They were hot, salty, and made you feel like you had cooked, even if all you did was boil water. The broth burned your mouth. The noodles were gone in a flash. But for 20 cents, it felt like a warm meal after a long day. And when money was tight, ramen filled more than just your stomach. It filled the gap between paychecks. Store-brand white bread was soft, cheap, and smashed flat the second you touched it. But it made everything work. You could get a whole loaf for less than half the price of name brands, and it lasted just long enough to get through the week. It stuck to peanut butter, disintegrated in soup, ripped if you tried to spread cold margarine across it. You could roll it into a ball, mash it with sugar, or fry it in a pan and still call it a meal. It was bland but dependable, the canvas for every poor kid sandwich ever made. Sometimes it came pre-sliced, sometimes it did not, but either way, it got used down to the last heel. But it was the base of every sandwich, toast, or late-night snack you could dream up. Fold it in half, and it became lunch. Toast it, and it felt like breakfast. There was no pride in it, but there was no shame either. It was bread, and when the shelves were almost bare, it meant no one would go hungry that day. Canned Vienna sausages were tiny, weirdly soft, and came packed in a salty gelatin that defied all explanation, but they were cheap and easy. You cracked open the can, drained the goo, and dumped the little pink sausages onto a plate, or a piece of bread, or just ate them straight with your fingers. They did not taste like real meat, but they tasted like something. They had a bounce to them, a strange, spongy texture that somehow grew on you over time. You could mash them, slice them, or skewer them with a toothpick and call them hors d'oeuvres. And when you were a kid, nothing beat the feeling of getting your own can, like it was made just for you. And in a world where something was sometimes all you could get, that counted. Kids loved them, adults tolerated them. Everyone had a can or two in the back of the cupboard. Because if all else failed, Vienna sausages still delivered calories, protein, and the strange comfort of food that never went bad. Day-old bread from the discount bin was a budget miracle if you got there early enough. Tucked in the corner of the store, marked down and bagged with a twist tie, it was yesterday's loaf, but it was today's meal. You could get rolls, bagels, hot dog buns, sometimes even cakes or pies for half the price. It was dry, a little stale, maybe squished. But you could revive it with a little toast, a little butter, or just enough imagination to make it work. It made the house smell warm, even if the food was on its second life. And finding something extra, like cinnamon raisin or garlic bread, felt like winning the lottery. But toast it, add butter, and you could turn it into something warm and good. Moms knew the timing, what day the new bread came in, what time they marked it down. And when money was tight, that discount rack was a lifeline. You did not call it expired, you called it smart shopping. Instant mashed potatoes were a miracle in a box, or at least that is what we told ourselves. You tore open the foil pouch, dumped those dry flakes into hot water, added a splash of margarine and maybe some milk if you had it. Then you stirred like your life depended on it. The lumps never fully dissolved. The texture was halfway between smooth and powdered drywall. But it was hot, and it was filling. And if you topped it with gravy from a can, or just pan drippings and a little salt, it suddenly felt like something closer to Sunday dinner. You could feed a whole family in 5 minutes, and no one had to peel a single potato. It was survival food, but it still found its way to the center of the plate more often than anyone cared to admit. Some nights, it was the main course. Other nights, it was the only course. You would fluff it with a fork, serve it beside canned vegetables, maybe sprinkle on some paprika just to make it feel fancy. It did not hold heat very long, and it turned gluey if it sat too long. But it was cheap, and it worked. The box never made it to the trash until you had scraped the corners and squeezed out every last portion. There was no pride in serving it, but there was pride in making something warm out of nearly nothing. That mattered. That meant dinner. Jiffy corn muffin mix came in a little blue and white box that looked more like a school project than food packaging, but what it made could feed a family. For a few cents and some water or milk and 1 egg if you had it, you got a dozen golden muffins that made the house smell like someone had been baking all day. You mixed it with a fork, baked it in muffin tins, or just poured the whole thing into a cake pan. They came out a little sweet, a little crumbly, and always a little undercooked in the middle if you were in a rush. Sometimes they stuck to the pan, sometimes they came out perfect. But either way, they got eaten. You dipped them in beans, crumbled them into chili, slathered them with margarine, or drizzled a little honey if you had a jar hidden in the back of the cupboard. It was the kind of food that made people feel full and satisfied, even when the rest of the meal was thin. Moms kept a few boxes on hand at all times, and when dinner needed stretching, out came the Jiffy mix. It was foolproof, fast and friendly to even the tightest grocery list. The smell alone could lift your mood. It said, "Something's cooking," even if the main dish was still figuring itself out. Canned ravioli or spaghetti was a blessing in a red sauce-splattered can. It was lunch, dinner, or sometimes a midnight snack, especially if no one felt like cooking. You peeled the lid, dumped the contents into a pot or directly into a bowl, and heated it up until it bubbled and burned your tongue. The noodles were soft. The sauce was sweet. The meat inside the ravioli was questionable. But you ate it anyway. It was hot. It was filling. It was easy. And when you were a kid, it felt like a treat, even if you later learned it was the cheapest thing in the cabinet. Some people doctored it up with cheese, others added hot dogs or leftover ground beef to give it more weight, but most just ate it straight from the can. You could feed a few kids on one can if you served it with white bread and a glass of powdered milk. It had a long shelf life, too, meaning it was always there when the fresh stuff ran out. You might roll your eyes at it now, but back then, it was a pantry hero. A can opener, a spoon, and a few minutes on the stove. That was all it took to have a hot meal on a cold night. And in the 1970s, that meant more than anyone wants to admit. Powdered milk was not a luxury. It was a necessity. It came in a cardboard box or a giant tin, and you mixed it with cold water, hoping for the best. You stirred and stirred, watching white clumps float around like tiny regrets, and finally let it sit until the bubbles went down. It never tasted like real milk. It was chalky, thin, and had a weird aftertaste you just got used to. But when you were poor, you drank it anyway, on cereal, in recipes, or straight from the cup when there was no alternative. You told yourself it was milk, because saying otherwise made breakfast a little harder to swallow. Kids could tell the difference instantly, but they drank it too because it was better than dry cereal. Sometimes moms stretched it by mixing it half and half with what was left of real milk. Sometimes it was all you had. The pitcher sat in the fridge, usually with a label saying, "Drink me," or "Use this first." No one fought over it, but it was always empty by week's end. It made mac and cheese possible. It kept mashed potatoes creamy. It filled in the blanks when everything else was running low. And it reminded you, every time you took a sip, that making do meant being creative with what you had. Tuna in oil with crackers was a humble little feast for anyone who needed protein on the cheap. You cracked the can open carefully, drained off the oily liquid as best you could, and scooped the tuna onto saltines like you were preparing hors d'oeuvres. It was salty, fishy, and oddly satisfying. The oil made it richer than water-packed tuna, and that mattered when you had nothing else on the plate. Sometimes there was mayonnaise to mix in, sometimes there was just mustard or pickle juice, and sometimes it was straight from the can with a spoon. Kids learned to like it, or at least tolerate it, because it showed up in lunchboxes more often than not, wrapped in wax paper, paired with a juice box or maybe just tap water. Adults appreciated it for its shelf life. It never went bad, and it did not require cooking. You could open a can and feel like you were doing all right, even if the fridge was close to empty. It was the kind of snack that kept you moving, gave you a little fuel, and reminded you that even the simplest things could hit the spot. Canned fruit cocktail was sweet, soft, and a little bit syrupy, but it felt like dessert. You opened the can with a crank or pull tab and dumped it into a bowl, syrup and all. The pieces were tiny cubes of pears, peaches, grapes, and that one red cherry that everyone fought over. It came chilled or room temperature. It was just fruit, but it felt like a treat. You would dig through the whole can just to find that cherry, even if it was half mushed by the time you got to it. The syrup was so sweet it made your teeth ache, but no one poured it down the drain. You sopped it up with bread, drank it straight, or saved it for the baby if you were feeling generous. Even if the fruit was soft and looked like it had been in the can since the war, it still counted as something good. And it was one of the only desserts poor families could keep on the shelf without worrying it would go bad. Even when the texture was mushy and the grapes were suspiciously pale, it still made your spoon feel special. You could add whipped topping if you had it, or serve it over dry cake to make it feel like celebration. For poor families, it was a go-to for school lunches, Sunday dinners, or nights when something sweet was needed to lift the mood. It lasted forever on the shelf and came cheap if you bought the store brand label. You might rinse the syrup off to cut the sugar, or pour it over cottage cheese to pretend it was fancy. But most of the time, you just grabbed a fork and ate it cold right out of the can. Because in a world of hard choices and tight budgets, fruit cocktail reminded you that sweetness could still find a way in. Margarine on saltines was not a recipe, it was a ritual. You took what you had and made it stretch. A sleeve of crackers, a tub of yellow spread, and a dull butter knife that always seemed to disappear when you needed it. You spread the margarine thin, then went back and added a little more. It melted just enough to feel like something warm. Sometimes you pressed the cracker down so hard it crumbled, but you ate the crumbs anyway. The margarine never tasted quite like butter, but that was not the point. It tasted like comfort. You could eat 6 or 7 in a row before even realizing you were full, or just distracted. Some days, this was your whole lunch. Other days, it was what you made when there was nothing else but quiet and a growling stomach. It was the kind of snack you did not brag about, but you never forgot. Sometimes you sprinkled sugar on top, or cinnamon if you were feeling fancy. Other times it was plain and dry, but it filled the silence between real meals. This was the kind of snack you ate when dinner was still 2 hours away and your stomach was already growling, or when you came home from school and there was not much else. Kids loved it. Adults made it. And somehow, it never stopped being comforting. The saltiness of the cracker, the smooth, slightly artificial taste of the margarine. It all came together in a way that felt like home. Not glamorous, not healthy, but enough. Frozen fish sticks were rectangle-shaped mysteries from the sea, but they were quick, cheap, and filled the plate. You baked them in the oven until the outside turned crisp and golden, or if you were impatient, you microwaved them and hoped for the best. They came out crunchy on one end, soggy on the other, but you dipped them in ketchup, or tartar sauce if you had it, and suddenly they were delicious. They smelled fishy, sure, but they also made the kitchen feel like something was cooking. And in poor households, that counted. Sometimes they stuck to the baking sheet and you had to scrape them off like burnt toast, but you still ate them. You could only afford name brand once in a while, so store-brand fish sticks became the go-to dinner on nights when money ran short. Kids would race to the oven just to get the crispiest ones and complain if they ended up with the soft centerpieces. Leftovers were rare, and when they did happen, someone always snagged them cold out of the fridge the next day. They were not fancy, but when served with a side of instant potatoes and canned peas, it felt like a full meal. And that was enough. You ate them with instant mashed potatoes, or peas from a can, or just on their own, standing at the counter while the rest of dinner finished. Some nights, they were the star of the meal. Other nights, they were the backup plan. But they always delivered something hot, something breaded, and something that tasted like effort, even when you knew it only took 15 minutes. Cream of mushroom soup, served straight or ladled over toast, was not just a meal, it was an invention. You took the can from the shelf, added a little water or milk, stirred until smooth, and made it work. Some nights it was a full meal. Other nights it was poured over stale bread to create something vaguely fancy. It was salty, thick, and stuck to your ribs in a way you needed when the fridge was bare. It never looked appetizing, but the moment it hit the plate, it smelled like warmth. You might add a pinch of pepper, a sprinkle of onion powder, or a leftover slice of cheese just to give it more life. You knew it came from a can, but with the lights low and a full stomach, it might as well have been homemade. It coated everything it touched, including the spoon, and left behind a bowl you had to scrub twice. But you never skipped it, because it filled the gap between hunger and hope, and sometimes that was all you needed. Add a little black pepper, maybe a slice of American cheese, and you had comfort on a plate. It was cheap. It was fast. It was everywhere. You might laugh at it now, but back then, cream of mushroom soup meant you were still trying. You were still putting something warm on the table. And that counted for a lot. Pinto beans by the pound were not just food, they were strategy. You soaked them overnight. You boiled them slow. You stirred them with whatever seasoning you had. A ham bone, an onion, just salt if that was all. The pot fed everyone. It lasted for days, and it only cost a few cents to make. You could smell it cooking before you walked in the door, and that alone was enough to ease a long day. They bubbled on the stove in a cast iron pot that looked like it had been through 4 wars and a depression. You served them with rice, cornbread, or rolled them into tortillas with a dab of margarine and called it lunch. Sometimes you mashed them and fried them. Other times you just ate them with a spoon and whatever leftovers were nearby. And no matter how poor you were, a warm bowl of beans made you feel full, in more ways than one. You could serve them with rice, fold them into tortillas, mash them onto toast, whatever you needed to make the meal stretch. Pinto beans were humble, hearty, and always welcome in a poor kitchen. They were protein, warmth, and care, all simmered into one bubbling pot. Evaporated milk on cereal was a last resort that somehow became routine. When the real milk ran out, or was just too expensive, you reached for that short, chubby can in the back of the cabinet. You popped the top with a can opener, poured it into a cup, and added a splash of water to thin it down. It never tasted quite right. It was thicker, creamier, and had a cooked flavor that made cornflakes taste like they had been dipped in soup. But it was cold, it was wet, and it turned dry cereal into something that could fill your stomach. You learned not to pour too much or your whole bowl would taste like warm custard. Some families used it all the time, not just on cereal, but in mashed potatoes, sauces, even coffee. It was cheaper than fresh milk and lasted forever, which made it a staple in poor kitchens where trips to the store had to be strategic. You kept a can or two just in case, and just in case came more often than not. Sometimes you poured it over sugar cereal and told yourself it tasted like dessert. Sometimes you used it on bran flakes and hoped the texture would grow on you. And other times, you just stirred it in, said nothing, and got through breakfast like it was another job to do. It might have made your cereal soggy fast, and it definitely clung to the spoon, but it worked. And in the 1970s, when the food budget had to stretch like a rubber band, that mattered more than flavor. You were not chasing perfection. You were chasing calories, protein, and the peace of knowing breakfast was handled, for at least one more morning. Frozen mixed vegetables in a brick were less a side dish and more a puzzle. You pulled the hard rectangle from the box and knocked it against the counter like you were trying to break ice. Inside was a multicolored mash of carrots, peas, corn, and lima beans, all frozen together in a single block of industrial unity. No one vegetable got to shine. They all tasted the same. Freezer. But once you boiled them long enough, they softened into something vaguely familiar. It was not about taste. It was about bulk. These bricks could feed a family of 5 for under 50 cents if you added enough butter, or margarine, which is what most of us used. You dumped them into a pot, added water, and hoped they would not stick. Sometimes they came out too mushy. Sometimes they stayed half frozen in the middle, but you ate them. You had to. They sat beside meatloaf, went into casseroles, or got scooped onto lunch trays in schools all across the country. If you were lucky, someone seasoned them. If not, they tasted like boiled nothing. But boiled nothing was better than nothing at all. You mashed them into potatoes, stirred them into rice, or served them with ketchup just to make them more palatable. And sometimes, you just ate them plain because filling your belly mattered more than impressing your tongue. Kids pushed them around on their plates, parents ate them silently. Everyone knew they were not great, but they were cheap, convenient, and kept the plate from looking empty. In poor households, a vegetable brick was not a compromise. It was a small, edible victory. Canned green beans, eaten cold and straight from the can, were the kind of thing you did not talk about, but you did it anyway. You opened the lid, maybe drained a little liquid, maybe not, and just started eating. No heating, no seasoning, no ceremony, just fork, can, and quiet resolve. They were limp, soft, and slightly salty, and if you grew up poor, you knew the taste by heart. Some nights, they were the only vegetable. Some days, they were lunch. You might eat them in the kitchen, standing at the counter, the can resting in one hand while the other kept busy. It was not glamorous. It was not fun. But it was food. It was fiber. And it was fast. Sometimes you would sprinkle a little pepper or hot sauce if you had it. Other times you would just stare into the can and try not to think too hard. Because cold green beans meant something else ran out first, the fresh stuff, the energy to cook, or just the will to care. And yet, even then, you cleaned that can down to the last stringy bean. It was not about enjoying it. It was about surviving it. The can sat heavy in your hand but light in your stomach, and once it was empty, you rinsed it and tossed it in the bin like it never happened. But you remembered. Everyone who grew up poor remembered. Because when the cupboards were thin and the options few, a cold can of beans was enough. Off-brand soda in 2-liter bottles was how you kept something fun in the fridge without blowing half the food budget. It did not matter what the flavor was supposed to be. It was grapish, cola-adjacent, or citrus with an aftertaste. What mattered was that it fizzed when you opened it and poured sweet carbonated hope into your scratched plastic cup. It went flat fast. It tasted like a science experiment. But it was cold, it was sugary, and it was yours. You bought it in bulk, 3 bottles for $1 if you caught the right sale. The labels were simple, no jingles, no mascots, just bold letters like cola or orange with an ingredients list that read like a chemistry exam. You drank it after school, at birthday parties, or with popcorn on Friday nights. Sometimes you mixed flavors just to make it interesting. Sometimes you stuck it in the freezer to make slushies. And sometimes, when no one was around, you drank it straight from the bottle. The fizz burned your throat just right for the first few sips, then vanished by morning. You would pour it over crushed ice, close your eyes, and pretend it was brand name. Because when money was tight, imagination did a lot of heavy lifting. You knew it was not the real stuff, but you did not care. It was soda. It was fun. And it reminded you that even in lean times, you still got to have something sweet, something bubbly, something just for you. Microwaving bologna until the edges curled was poor kid culinary genius. You laid it flat on a paper towel, maybe sliced a few cuts around the edge so it would not bubble up too much, and nuked it until the rim crisped like a little meat crown. The center puffed up, hot and greasy, with that unmistakable smell of lunchroom survival. You knew it was ready when the corners snapped like bacon. It was fast, it was salty, it was weirdly satisfying. You could slap it between 2 slices of white bread and call it a sandwich, add a slice of government cheese if you were really living right, or just eat it plain, off the plate, while standing barefoot in the kitchen. Sometimes you folded it up and dipped it in mustard. Other times, you added a pickle and tried to convince yourself it was deli style. It popped, hissed, and left grease stains on the microwave tray that no one ever really cleaned. You made it because it was easy, because it was cheap, because one slice of bologna could go from sad to snack with 30 seconds and a microwave. And when you sat down and ate it, it felt like you had figured out something adults had not. It was not a meal, but it was something warm, something salty, and something that made you feel just a little bit clever. In the 70s, a curled piece of bologna was not just a snack. It was a moment of control in a world that did not always offer many. Canned Vienna sausages were soft, salty, and kind of weird, but they worked. You popped the lid and pulled out a row of pale, jelly-covered mini hot dogs packed tight in mystery water. They smelled like a meat factory and looked like baby food for adults. But you ate them cold with crackers or fried them in a pan and called it breakfast. They were cheap, portable, and weirdly satisfying. Each sausage was the size of your finger and had the consistency of room-temperature butter. You could not slice them without squishing them, but you did anyway, because they were meat, and meat was meat, especially when money was tight. You found them in discount stores, food pantries, and packed in your lunchbox when there was nothing else. They did not require refrigeration, which made them a pantry MVP, and no matter how questionable they looked, you were always glad they were there. They came in pop-top cans with paper labels that peeled off in the heat, and no matter how many times you gagged at the first bite, you always finished the can. They lasted forever in the cupboard. They showed up during hurricanes, blackout dinners, and those long weeks before payday. Canned Vienna sausages were not loved, but they were there. And when you had nothing else, that was enough. You could spot the big boy statue from the parking lot, that grinning kid holding up a cheeseburger like it was the crown jewel of America. And in the 1970s, he really was. Big boy restaurants were warm, welcoming, and wrapped in that all-important family vibe. Cozy booths, laminated menus, and milkshakes that showed up tall and frosty. This was classic diner comfort. Big Boy served everything. Seriously, everything. Burgers, meatloaf, pancakes, fried fish, pie, spaghetti. It was the Swiss Army knife of chain dining. No matter who you came with, a picky kid, a meat and potatoes dad, or a grandma who just wanted soup, everyone found something they liked. But the star was the Big Boy combo. A double-decker cheeseburger with that signature sauce that somehow tasted exactly the same in every state. And that was the magic. No matter where you were, a Big Boy meal felt familiar. The restaurants themselves felt like home away from home. Staff who remembered your name, booths you sank into, and that little paper placemat you always ended up doodling on while you waited. It was not fancy, but it was ours. And let us not forget the desserts. Hot fudge cake, banana splits, pies that came in rotating displays. They always had something sweet waiting at the end. Big Boy was not trying to reinvent the wheel. It just made sure everyone in the car left full and happy. In a time before foodie culture and Instagram menus, Big Boy reminded people that a good meal did not have to be complicated. Just warm, filling, and shared with the ones you love. The dairy farm drive-thru felt like something out of a storybook. You did not get out of the car. You just rolled forward slowly on a gravel path that crunched under the tires like popcorn, while the smell of hay and cream filled the air. Wooden signs pointed the way. Milk, cream, eggs, and sometimes fresh butter today. Dad would pull up to the window, nod at the farmhand, and exchange a couple of glass bottles like they were precious cargo. You could hear them clinking together softly in the metal crate behind the seat, already cold with condensation. If you had been on your best behavior, meaning no backseat bickering and no complaints during the wait, he would ask the real question, "You want a cone?" It was always a yes. The scoop was big, the cone was soggy by the time you were halfway through, and somehow it still tasted like heaven. Sometimes Dad would get one too and say, "Best $2 I ever spent." And as the cows in the distance mooed lazily and the sun painted gold across the field, you realized simple things could feel grand. But if you think that was charming, just wait until you step inside the used bookstore that sold both dusty novels and ham radios whispering from across the country. There was a time when TWA meant elegance, a time when stepping onto a Transworld Airlines flight was like entering a luxury hotel in the sky. The seats were wide, the service crisp, the logo iconic. From movie stars to newlyweds, everyone wanted to fly TWA. It was part of the golden age of air travel. But by the 1970s, the clouds were darkening. Deregulation hit hard. New competitors raced into the skies, offering faster routes and cheaper fares. Fuel prices soared, labor disputes dragged on, and TWA's once glorious reputation began to buckle. What once felt like flying with royalty now felt outdated and expensive. Suddenly, the airline of tomorrow had become yesterday's news. It expanded too quickly, bought too many jets, and could not keep up with the ruthless economics of modern air travel. Bankruptcy became a familiar word. By the time American Airlines absorbed what remained in the early 2000s, the brand was already a shadow. Airports removed the signs, crews traded uniforms, but the memory lingered. For anyone who flew TWA during its heyday, there was nothing like it. Now, it is a name buried under decades of debt and nostalgia, a ghost with wings. Lawn chemicals with DDT were sprayed across suburban America like miracle dust. In the 1970s, lush green grass was practically a status symbol, and DDT was the secret weapon. It promised to kill bugs, weeds, and just about anything that dared disturb your tidy front yard. Garden hoses were connected to chemical sprayers, and entire blocks smelled like synthetic citrus and poison. Nobody warned you to stay inside. In fact, kids ran barefoot through freshly treated lawns, chasing sprinklers and dodging dandelions while their skin soaked in the residue. Pets rolled in it, parents barbecued on it, and when rain hit, those chemicals went straight into the sidewalk gutters. DDT had already raised alarms in scientific circles, but in neighborhoods everywhere, it was just another tool in the garage. The packaging featured sunny lawns and happy families, not skulls or warnings. It wasn't uncommon to see a bottle of weed killer sitting on the porch next to the lemonade. By the late 1970s, it was banned for agricultural use in the United States. But traces lingered in soil and water for years. It affected birds, fish, children, pretty much everything it touched. Today, DDT is infamous for its lasting environmental impact and connection to declining wildlife populations. But back then, it was just part of Saturday chores. And if your lawn didn't smell like chemicals, your furniture definitely did. There was a time when S and H green stamps were as good as cash. You collected them with every grocery run, every gas station stop, every purchase that counted. And then you filled the little books. Carefully, patiently, with the pride of someone building something out of nothing. Families traded them in for toasters, radios, even bicycles. It felt like free rewards for loyalty. A quiet handshake between shopper and store. The moment you tore out a full book and handed it over felt like winning something without spending a dime. For many working-class families, it was the only kind of bonus life ever handed out. But loyalty changed. By the late 1970s, inflation had twisted prices beyond recognition, and stamps felt like yesterday's trick. Credit cards came in, bringing points and cashback offers. Big box stores offered everyday low prices instead of incentives. And suddenly, people did not want to save pages of stamps anymore. They wanted savings now. S&H tried to pivot, offering catalogs, electronics, even vacations. But it was too late. The books sat half-filled in kitchen drawers, forgotten. The redemption centers closed. The stamp became a relic. And with it, the ritual faded. Ask someone who grew up with S&H, and they will smile at the memory. But they will also tell you when it ended, it felt like losing part of what made everyday shopping feel like a game worth playing. W.T. Grant was not just a department store, it was a part of the American landscape. In the 1970s, it had over 1,000 locations. Main streets, suburban malls, strip centers. W.T. Grant was everywhere. It sold clothes, appliances, hardware, school supplies. You could buy a pair of jeans, a toaster, and a lawn chair in one trip. But behind the counters, trouble brewed. Management wanted growth, and they wanted it fast. Stores were built too quickly. Debt piled up. And worst of all, they handed out credit like candy. Their revolving charge account let customers buy now, pay later, with no real system to check if they could afford it. The trust they gave customers was generous, but fatally blind. W.T. Grant did not just run out of money, it ran out of time. The losses mounted. In 1976, W.T. Grant filed for bankruptcy. It was one of the largest retail collapses in American history. Thousands of workers lost jobs, communities lost familiar storefronts, and shoppers lost a place that felt like home. Unlike other stores that faded quietly, Grant's collapse was loud, public, and painful. It was a warning shot across the bow of American retail. Grow too fast, trust too much, and the walls will fall. People still remember the logo, the way the floors creaked, the smell of new shoes in a cardboard box. But the store itself is gone. The camera and film shop was a cathedral of forgotten technology. You walked in, and the air smelled like chemicals and time. Behind the counter, rows of yellow Kodak envelopes waited like tiny mysteries. Dad would head straight for the slide carousel projectors, lifting one like it was a sacred artifact. Kodachrome, he would whisper. They just don't make colors like that anymore. You did not know what he meant, but you believed it. You spun the projector just to hear the satisfying click, click, click of slides falling into place. There were shelves of lenses, tripods, flash bulbs in boxes older than you, and glass cases of second-hand cameras that looked more like museum pieces. Dad talked shop with the clerk, dropping words like aperture and ISO like he was reading from scripture. You picked up a Polaroid and tried to figure out how it worked. The clerk let you snap one. The photo came out blurry, overexposed, but it still felt like magic. Dad bought a roll of film, maybe 2, even though he already had 6 at home. Just in case, he would say, just in case the light hit right. And on the drive home, with the bag of film in his lap, he would say, "One quick stop." That stop? A smoky little pool hall where you got a taste of grown-up cool, even if just for one night. Generic peanut butter was a gamble, but you took it. It came in a tan jar with a white label that said peanut butter and nothing else. No cartoon bears, no crunchy option. Just oil on top, cement on the bottom, and a knife stuck somewhere in between. You stirred until your hand ached. You scraped and scooped. You tasted it and blinked twice. It was bitter. It was bland. But it was peanut butter, and peanut butter meant sandwiches. You smeared it on stale bread and added jelly if you had it. Sometimes just sugar, sometimes nothing. It stuck to the roof of your mouth and stayed there. But it kept you full until dinner. It did not spread well, and it never looked appetizing. But it filled a sandwich with calories, and that was the only thing that mattered. It was cheaper than the name brand and lasted longer too, mostly because no one was sneaking spoonfuls when Mom was not looking. You brought it to school in a paper bag and traded it if you were lucky. But even if nobody wanted it, you still ate every bite, because it was food. And in the 1970s, that was enough. The strip mall pet store did not smell like adventure. It smelled like wood shavings and fish food. But when Dad said, "Let's stop in for a minute," you knew it meant 20. The walls were lined with glass tanks full of turtles, frogs, and fish that looked too bright to be real. You would press your nose against the glass and point. "That one. I want that one." Dad would shake his head and smile. "We're not getting a turtle." 5 minutes later, you were holding a goldfish in a plastic bag, trying not to spill it on the seat of the car. He was not a pushover. He just knew the power of a memory. And that pet store, as humble as it was, felt like a mini zoo to you. There was always one sleepy lizard under a heat lamp and a parrot that squawked like a broken doorbell. Sometimes you would hear, "Hey there," from across the room and realize the bird was mocking you. Dad would strike up a conversation with the guy behind the counter like they were old war buddies, swapping advice on filters and food pellets. You would head home with a tank, a packet of food, and a new responsibility you were not quite ready for. And when you were ready for something outdoorsy, Dad knew just the place, with canoes and no life jackets in sight. Leisure World was not just a retirement community, it was a promise, a dream built on sunshine, shuffleboard, and stress-free living. Born in the 1970s, Leisure World offered gated bliss for seniors, condos, golf carts, social clubs, and security. It was pitched as paradise for the golden years. But paradise costs money. And by the 1980s, cracks started to show. Economic downturns hit retirement savings hard. Fixed incomes did not match rising maintenance fees. And some residents found that the dream came with hidden rules, strict covenants, and unexpected costs. The promise of simplicity turned into a maze of fine print. For many residents, retirement began to feel like a contract they never meant to sign. Lawsuits followed, disputes over control, access, and promises made but not kept. What began as a utopia turned, in many places, into something colder. Today, some Leisure World communities still exist, but the shine is gone. The brochures have aged. The palm trees are the same, but the illusion has faded. For many, it is still home. But for others, it was a broken promise wrapped in sunshine. A reminder that even dreams built in good faith can crack under real pressure. Spray fixative for art containing benzene gave every elementary art class that weird industrial edge. If you ever made a charcoal sketch or pastel masterpiece, chances are someone gave it a glossy finish with a fixative spray that doubled as a mini chemical hazard. The stuff smelled strong, like sharp varnish and nail polish remover had a baby, and teachers would often wave their hands around it saying, "Don't breathe too much of this in." But in rooms with no ventilation, that was easier said than done. Benzene was the key ingredient in many of those sprays, prized for its quick-drying power and ability to seal artwork without smudging. But what wasn't advertised on the can? Benzene is highly flammable, causes bone marrow suppression, and has been definitively linked to leukemia. Art classes were basically low-grade hazmat zones. Eventually, safer alternatives were developed, and benzene was restricted or banned from most consumer products. Still, the damage lingered. For many kids, the smell of creativity was also the smell of chemical exposure. And while we're on the topic of childhood routines, let's talk about the daily boiling ritual that now sounds downright medieval. Woolco was supposed to be the next evolution of Woolworths. It had the size of a department store and the soul of a 5 and dime. Launched in the 1960s and booming into the 1970s, Woolco promised everything in one place: clothes, toys, appliances, groceries. For families used to making a dozen different stops, it felt like magic. A bright red sign that said you could get it all without going broke. But behind that promise was chaos. Poor inventory systems, outdated layouts, stores too big to manage and too cluttered to navigate. And then came the competition. Kmart, Target, Walmart. Retail giants with cleaner shelves, sharper prices, and better supply chains. Woolco could not keep up. It became the store you only visited when you had to. The store where the lights buzzed too loud and the shelves were always half empty. By the 1980s, most Woolcos had either been shut down or sold off. Some were turned into malls, others just disappeared, and with them went a small piece of how we used to shop, wandering the aisles on Saturday mornings, dreaming about toys, picking out socks with Mom. Woolco was not perfect, but it was familiar, and we miss it more than we admit. W.T. Grant was not just a department store, it was a part of the American landscape. In the 1970s, it had over 1,000 locations, main streets, suburban malls, strip centers. W.T. Grant was everywhere. It sold clothes, appliances, hardware, school supplies. You could buy a pair of jeans, a toaster, and a lawn chair in one trip. But behind the counters, trouble brewed. Management wanted growth, and they wanted it fast. Stores were built too quickly. Debt piled up, and worst of all, they handed out credit like candy. Their revolving charge account let customers buy now, pay later, with no real system to check if they could afford it. The trust they gave customers was generous, but fatally blind. W.T. Grant did not just run out of money, it ran out of time. The losses mounted. In 1976, W.T. Grant filed for bankruptcy. It was one of the largest retail collapses in American history. Thousands of workers lost jobs, communities lost familiar storefronts, and shoppers lost a place that felt like home. Unlike other stores that faded quietly, Grant's collapse was loud, public, and painful. It was a warning shot across the bow of American retail. Grow too fast, trust too much, and the walls will fall. People still remember the logo, the way the floors creaked, the smell of new shoes in a cardboard box. But the store itself is gone. Off-brand cereal in a bag was not cool, but it was affordable. No cartoon mascots, no box, no toy surprise, just a giant plastic sack of crunchy shapes that looked almost, but not quite, like the name brand. Fruity Circles instead of Fruit Loops, Corn Crunch instead of Corn Pops, Marshmallow Magic instead of Lucky Charms, and every flavor was a little off. You poured it into a bowl with powdered milk and called it breakfast. It got soggy fast. It stuck to your teeth. But you still ate 2 bowls and called it a good morning. Moms bought it because it lasted a week and cost less than a movie ticket. You ate it because it was sweet, kind of. It came in huge bags that barely fit in the pantry. You clipped it shut with a clothespin and prayed for freshness. The marshmallows crumbled, the flakes broke, but it fed the whole house and nobody dared waste it. In the 1970s, off-brand cereal was not shameful. It was smart. And if you were lucky, it even came in chocolate. Braniff International Airways was not just an airline. It was a fashion show in the sky, a flying work of art with orange planes, purple interiors, and flight attendants dressed by Halston. It was the kind of thing only the 1970s could dream up, and only the 1970s could destroy. It started with color and glamour. People felt like royalty walking onto a Braniff jet, but underneath the paint and press photos was a brutal truth. The airline industry was changing. Gas prices were soaring. Deregulation was coming. Braniff spent money like it was printing it, buying more jets, building grander lounges, and betting big on routes it could not afford. When the economy crashed and fuel costs doubled, Braniff found itself choking on luxury. Passengers stopped flying for style. They wanted cheap. They wanted direct. They wanted reliable. Braniff had become a symbol of excess in a decade no longer willing to pay for it. By the time it folded in 1982, people barely blinked. The planes were grounded, the bright colors faded, and the dream of glamorous air travel took one final nosedive. Ask anyone who flew Braniff in its prime. They will smile, maybe even tear up. Then they will tell you it never stood a chance. Asbestos ceiling tiles and insulation were practically a design trend in the 1970s. You saw those popcorn ceilings and fuzzy-looking pipe wrappings in homes, schools, offices, everywhere. Nobody warned you not to touch it. Nobody wore masks when cutting into it. In fact, it was marketed as a safety feature, fire-resistant, soundproof, and easy to install. It was the miracle material that builders swore by, and people loved how quiet it made things. Kids sat through classes under ceilings full of it. Parents hung out in basements lined with it. But what no one knew, or chose to ignore, was how the fibers could break loose, float into your lungs, and stay there forever. Asbestos exposure doesn't cause immediate symptoms. It creeps in years later, showing up as mesothelioma or lung disease long after the danger is gone. Once science caught up, the lawsuits started. Suddenly, that fluffy insulation was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Contractors had to wear hazmat suits just to remove it, and homeowners were left wondering how many years they had breathed it in. Today, it's banned in most uses and strictly regulated in others. But back then, it was part of the wallpaper of life. And if the walls and ceilings weren't enough, your first aid kit might have been just as questionable. The Pontiac Aztec was a disaster in the early 2000s, but its roots stretch back to the 1970s. Back then, car designers were quietly sketching new ideas, crossovers, hybrid shapes, something between a van and an SUV. The oil crisis had made the auto industry rethink everything. What if utility and economy could live in the same shell? Those early concepts never left the drawing board, but they stayed in the shadows, mutating over time. Somewhere between vision and reality, the design lost its soul. What rolled out of the factory felt more like compromise than innovation. And when the market finally seemed ready for something different, Pontiac pulled the trigger. What came out was the Aztec. It was bold. It was weird. It was ahead of its time, and somehow behind it. The angles were wrong. The plastic cladding was cheap, and the name sounded like a dare. Consumers recoiled, sales tanked, and Pontiac, already in trouble, never really recovered. But behind the jokes, behind the Breaking Bad memes and design flops, there was something sad about it all. The Aztec was born from good intentions, from a desire to break the mold and recapture relevance. Instead, it became a punchline. Proof that even bold ideas, especially bold ideas, can fail spectacularly. Kool-Aid packets were magic. If you had sugar. For 5 cents, you got a tiny envelope of dust and dreams. Cherry, grape, orange, lemonade. It did not matter. You dumped it in a pitcher, added water, and stirred with a giant spoon. Then came the sugar. A full cup, maybe 2. Or, if money was tight, half a cup and a prayer. The weaker it was, the more it burned going down. But it was still cold, still bright, still yours. You drank it from jelly jars, poured it into ice cube trays, called it punch, and served it at birthday parties. It stained your clothes, your lips, your countertop, and you still loved it. It was summer in a plastic pitcher, and it lasted for days. You could stretch one packet across a whole week, especially if nobody noticed it got thinner by the glass. And when you had friends over, it felt like serving a special drink, even if it was mostly tinted water. Kool-Aid was never fancy, but in a kitchen without soda or juice, it felt like a treat. And in a house on a budget, a 5-cent flavor went a long way. He never bought a thing, and we never needed a thing, but the appliance store on Route 17, that was a showroom of dreams. The moment you stepped inside, it was like the future had been laid out under fluorescent lights. Fridges the size of Cadillacs, dishwashers that promised miracles, and those clunky microwaves that looked like they could launch satellites. Dad would do the full lap, hands in pockets, nodding like he understood the specs. "Now this here's got dual defrost," he would say, which meant absolutely nothing to any of us. Meanwhile, you were just there for one thing, the donut samples. Right by the scratch and dent section, on a little fold-out table with a paper plate and toothpicks stabbed into sugar-dusted treasures. If you got lucky, there might even be coffee, lukewarm, but still free. Sometimes a salesman would corner Dad, and he would nod solemnly, asking questions like he was running a restaurant and not just trying to keep the toaster alive for another year. It was never about buying. It was about imagining. About standing in front of a top-of-the-line freezer and picturing your name on the deed to a better life. But when it came to good times and cheap thrills, nothing froze time quite like the local bowling alley. Oldsmobile was the brand your grandfather trusted. It was dependable, steady, and proudly American. In the 1970s, it was one of General Motors' most successful lines. The Cutlass was everywhere. Parking lots, driveways, high school graduation gifts. It was a badge of middle-class confidence. But times changed. Japanese automakers brought new efficiency. The luxury market moved to BMW and Mercedes-Benz, and Oldsmobile struggled to define itself. Was it sporty? Was it classic? Was it for young drivers or retirees? The answers never came. Designs grew stale. Performance lagged. The name Oldsmobile started to feel like a joke no one wanted to explain. By the time they rebranded, no one was listening, and the name started to sound old. By the 1990s, Oldsmobile felt like a brand out of time. Sales dropped. Dealers lost faith. General Motors tried to rebrand it, update it, give it a new face. But it was too late. The final Oldsmobile rolled off the line in 2004. For decades, it was the quiet heart of the American road. And then it was gone. Not with a crash, but with a sigh. A slow fade into silence. And if you ever drove one, you remember. The smell of the vinyl seats, the hum of the engine on a long drive. Oldsmobile did not just fail, it retired. If one of these snacks took you back, or made you smile at how far a dollar used to go, drop your favorite in the comments. Give this video a like to keep the memories fresh, and subscribe so we can keep sharing the stories that never made it to the menu.